I'm going to show you 10 tips that will elevate your black and white photos from bland to beautiful. I'll show you how to fake long exposure in the sky using motion blur so we can get that smooth ethereal feel without the need for actual long exposure shots. I'll also show you ways we can guide the viewer's eye into carefully crafted pockets of light. This lets us bring attention to the most compelling parts of our photo. Finally, I'll walk you through adding those finishing touches with bespoke looks and subtle color grading. These are the steps that give our black and white landscapes depth, mood, and a unique feel that truly stands out. These are just a few of the techniques we'll cover, so stay tuned and let's take your black and white photo editing to the next level. I'll be using Luminar Neo for the editing today, but don't worry if you're using a different photo editor because many of these techniques are cross-transferable. Okay, let's get into it. Let me start off by showing you what you shouldn't do. If you go straight to the saturation slider and think, well, if I pull out all of the color from the image, I've created a black and white. Well, yes, you have, but it looks flat, lifeless, and tepid. Let me reset that and show you another approach you may be taking, which is coming into the black and white tool and just converting to black and white that way. That gives us a little bit more flexibility because we can control the color channels individually, and that's really useful. However, we've still got a pretty boring image at the moment. So let's just reset that black and white and let me show you my approach. So the first thing we could do is actually apply a monochrome profile. So if you don't see your profiles, just write profile in the description and I'll share a link to a video I've done on how to set that up. But what we're after initially is trying to maximize the contrast and the dynamic range in our raw photo. So part of that is to make sure that we have all the information that we want in the highlights of our photo. So usually taking that slider down to the left just reveals a little bit of highlights there, and also revealing information in the shadows as well. You can see if I push that all of the way up, we flatten everything out. That's not what we want. We just want to reveal enough information in the shadows so that the software has information to work with for the rest of the edit. Now, one of the most important things to do when setting this photo up for editing in black and white is to make sure that we have a fully expanded tonal range. Now, we can see the representation of that in the histogram right here. You want to make sure that this graph stretches all the way from the bottom left all the way to the top right, but you don't want to be losing information. You can see how on the far right over here, it looks as if the distribution of this information would just carry on off of the graph. That's not what we want, and we can also see that represented visually on our photo by these red warning pixels. And the way to turn those on if you don't see them, the quick way is just press J on your keyboard, that gets rid of them, press J again, that turns them on. And not only do we have highlight warnings, but we also have clipping warnings for the black pixels as well. So where we start to see blue, we've gone too far and we've lost information. Now, I have explained this before, but the best way to actually set your white and black points isn't in fact with the black and white sliders. So double click to reset those. The best way to do it is actually with the curves tool. So all we're going to do is grab the top right point, which represents the white pixels. And as you move that over to the left, we brighten those pixels up. And all we want to do is move it to a point where we literally just start to see a tiny, tiny spattering of those red pixels. Something like that. That's pretty good. And currently, if we look at the left-hand side of the histogram here that represents the darker pixels, this very far edge should be pushed all the way over to the far left of where the graph should start. And the way we fix that is just to grab the bottom left-hand point here. And as I move that over to the right, you can basically see that we have pushed all of those pixels to pure black as shown by the warning pixels indicated in blue. And what we want to do is just move that over to a point that, again, we just start to see a smattering of those blue pixels, maybe even a little bit less than that. There we go. That looks like a really good starting point for our black and white. Let's look at the original, very washed out, flat and tepid. And now we have a pre-processed image, which is full of contrast and a complete dynamic range that we know starts at pure black and runs all the way to pure white. Let's continue adding contrast, and a really great tool for this in Luminar Neo is the Super Contrast tool. That allows us to control the contrast in the highlights, in the midtones, and the shadows as well. Now, I'm just going to apply this selectively to the sky for now. The highlights balance slider lets us either brighten things up or darken them down. And I'm just looking for a nice amount of contrast in this photo at the moment. So I'm just going to bring the contrast amount up. And now with the mid-tone slider as well, I'm just going to have a little play with that, maybe darken down those surrounding clouds a little bit. And if I push the shadow contrast up and then grab that slider as well, if I move that around, currently all it's doing is affecting the land there. So that's not really helping us because all I want to do is affect the sky here. And to do that, I'll come into the masking section, and a nice easy way to apply an effect to the sky is just to add a linear gradient pulling down through the sky so it just tapers off as it meets the land. And now if I just jump into the edit stack so that we can see that actual tool and turn it off and then back on, you can see that we've just added some contrast to the sky. If your software doesn't have super contrast, another option you've got is to apply a curves tool. So if I just jump into the develop section here where it's housed in Luminar Neo and jump into curves, all you want to do is just add a bit of an S shape into that curve. And you can see the more aggressive we get with that curve, the more contrast we add. But if you're going to focus just on the sky only, what you want to do is just watch the sky, just disregard everything else in the foreground, and just work on the contrast there. And again, you can mask that in. I know we've got a few dust spots in the sky, but I'm not concerned about that. And shortly you will see why. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You probably sat there going, well, Anthony, why are you working in color when our ultimate goal is a beautiful black and white photo? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Keeping our photo in color mode for as long as possible actually gives us better quality in the long run because it gives all of the tools that we're using access to more data. Rather than just being black and white, we have access to a red, green, and blue channel. And that is additional information that the tools can use to give us a better result when we're using them. Furthermore, when we do our black and white conversion, we can access the individual colors in the photo to control the brightness of those specific colors. So ideally, we want to do as much of the groundwork editing in color as possible. Part of the appeal of good black and whites is to define areas of texture and areas that are soft. And currently through this photo, we have a lot of detail and a lot of texture throughout. I'd say it's only the very top left third that doesn't really have too much in the way of information. Everywhere else is really busy. So if I do a very quick black and white convert, you'll see that our eye kind of bounces around all over the place because there's so many places to look. And so it's up to us as photo editors to kind of define where the viewer is going to go to with their eye. And so what I'd like to do is say, hey, look through this central part of the frame here. This is really important. You know, as the road leads in through the mountains here, I want this area to be the most visually interesting part of the photo. Up here in the sky, we've got a lot of detail with the clouds. And through these next couple of steps, what I'd like to do is create a juxtaposition where we have a smooth top third, a really interesting central third, and then a less interesting bottom third, potentially even just darkening that down so that our eye goes to the brighter part through here. So dealing to this central part here, we're going to add some structure. And I'm going to get rid of that black and white filter because, as I said, we want to work in color for as long as possible. So I'm going to come to the Structure AI tool, and I'm just going to grab the amount slider and push that all the way to 100. Now, currently it's really excessive, I know, but sometimes it's worth also just grabbing that boost slider, pushing that up, and just pushing this to the absolute extreme to see just how far you can take this effect. Now, another thing to be aware of, if we bring the amount down and leave the boost up, basically the boost is not the same as taking the amount slider from 100 to 200 by adding on more boost. It's not the same thing. So you can actually play with these two sliders and see how they balance together to actually get the look that you're after. If you're working in Lightroom, the clarity slider is going to do a very similar thing for you. Now I'm going to come in with the brush here, and I'm just going to start introducing this effect only through the center of the frame here. And I'm going to do that with the paintbrush. So I'll create a nice big brush by pushing the size all the way up. Make sure my softness is to 100. And rather than having the strength really heavy-handed at 100, what I like to do is set that rather low. Around 17 is fine. And then I can just paint this effect in and start building it up in passes. So if we just look at the before and after of that, now we have a much more subtle effect. But by playing with the size of the brush and coming in slightly, we can now start to double that effect up, maybe around the road and more towards the base of the valley itself. So before and after, you can see that the attention is now being focused here, right in the middle of the frame. So we've got a lovely bit of detail running through the center of the frame. What I'd like to do now is create a complement to that by softening up the sky. And so we're going to create a fake long exposure look. Let me show you how to do that. So we need to add a motion blur. So you'll find that in the creative section and come to blur, choose the motion option. And now as we crank the amount up, it starts to look as if we're whipping the camera from left to right. So this is the before and the after. This isn't the final result by any means. We're going to finesse this a little bit, but we're going to have to build this up in layers because I don't feel like I'm getting enough of the look I'm after. We can also change the angle as well, so we can make it look as if the clouds are moving out and up towards the top right here. So that's not a bad option. Let's go for that for now and let's mask that in. So I'm going to come to the masking option, and we've got a few different ways we could do this, but I'm going to try the mask AI option, let Luminar do its calculations, and I'm just going to select the sky option and see what that does for me. It's okay, but I really don't want any of that blur coming over the land formation, so I'll just use the brush in erase mode. This time I will push my strength very high, set my brush just a little bit smaller, and I'm using the bracket keys to do that. The left bracket key just reduces the size of the brush. So I'll close that tool down, and by opening it again, I get to add a brand new instance of this effect. We can create a doubling down of the effect. So if I grab the amount slider and push that all the way up now we are adding on the top of the effect that we had before. Again, we can play with the angle slider to get the look that we're after. And I don't want to match the angle exactly because it starts to create quite harsh lines going through the sky. What I want to do is have a similar angle, but not quite the same. And that's going to give me a slightly softer look. Before and after. Yep, something like that's looking pretty good. I'll come to my masking option, and this time I'm just going to brush this in. I'll go with a strength of 50%, a size of 400 so I can get this done relatively quickly. And I'm going to put more of the effect to the far right and less of the effect going towards the center of the frame. And how far you take this effect is entirely up to you. If you wanted to go for yet another application of it, so it looks like it's blurring even more, then you can absolutely do that as well. All right, if I flick to the original, you can see all the detail in the cloud there, and then look at our fake long exposure. That's quite nice, and that's going to work really well with the black and white photo. The time to convert this to black and white is when you want to start assessing the actual tonal value in your photo, i.e. you really want to start focusing on the contrast in your photo, the relationship between the bright pixels and the dark pixels. And sometimes the only way to really assess that properly is to create a black and white version. So currently all I've done is desaturate this, but there is obviously a much better way to do that gives us access to all of the color information to control the brightness values, and that's with this black and white tool. And what it allows us to do is control the brightness values in the frame based on the color that was there in the original photo. So for example, we have more blue in the sky, hence the reason that that is changing as I move the blue slider up and down. There's more yellow in the foreground, and that is why that is getting lighter and darker as I move that slider. So it gives us a lot of flexibility. However, here's a tip for you. Let's not convert to black and white yet until we've done this other step. So to give us maximum bang for our buck with our conversion, we want to give the tool as much color information to work with as possible. So we can add a saturation bump. And I'm doing that here by just popping up the vibrance and the saturation in the color tool before and after. Quite like the look of that actually. But anyway, we're doing a black and white one. So let's come to the black and white tool, convert to black and white. And now you'll see that we can have a more impactful change by grabbing these sliders because those colors were more saturated to start with. So look at the difference in the sky. We can add more contrast now because more blue existed in the sky because we added saturation before we did this conversion. And having the ability to control the luminance in this way gives us a lot of control over our photo. And this is where we can start to express our aesthetic preferences. So for me personally, I don't want the brightness value of the foreground to compete with that of the middle ground, because I want our viewer to be led into the center of the frame here. So it would make sense if the center part of our frame was brighter than this foreground here. So converting to black and white in this way gives us the ability to do that. Now you don't want to darken things down too much because you're going to lose information in the photo. Just a subtle drop in darkness is all we need here. Before and after, before and after. Okay, we're moving in the right direction. Now I'm going to show you a little technique that I often use. I call it my light sandwich, and basically it's a way that I darken down the sky and darken down the foreground, hence bringing our attention to the center of the frame here. So to initiate that, we just need a tool that darkens things down. So the exposure slider is a really good option. Also, we have the ability to darken things down with curves as well, whichever tool you're familiar with. We can also use a combination of both, as I have done here. But the key is with the masking. So basically, I'm going to bring this effect in from the top down. That's step one. And then I'm also going to bring the effect from the bottom up. Now, we've already darkened the foreground as part of our conversion, so I probably don't need to go as heavy-handed with this. Let's have a look. Before and after. Before and after. Yeah, it may just be a little bit too much. And if that's the case, we can always come back into our brush in erase mode, drop the strength down, and just take away a little bit of the impact of that effect. Before and after, and just notice the way that your eye starts to get drawn towards the center of the frame. So much of what we're doing when we're creating impactful black and whites is just controlling where our viewer is looking. And we do that by highlighting certain areas and darkening others. And a really great tool for doing that is the dodge and burn tool. So let me show you how I would do that in this photo. Okay, we find the dodge and burn tool in the professional section and we click dodge and burn. You guys got your professional hats on? Do hope so. Right, here we go. We have two options. We can either lighten. So if we start painting on our photo like that, we are lightening up. And if we choose darken and start painting, we are darkening down. We can change the softness of our brush so that we have a hard-edged brush, but obviously that's not particularly useful. We want a nice soft one. And we also have the strength slider so that we can go even more heavy-handed with the effect. So now you know our options. Let's just reset that and we're going to start again. So I will usually start by breaking my dodge and burn into two separate applications. One time I will be applying burn, as I'm in this case here, and then I will come back in and work on a separate instance of the tool to apply the lightening version. And keeping them separate that way is actually a really nice way to work. As I work my way around the image, I've got my fingers on the bracket key so that I can dynamically change the size of the brush as I work my way around, and I need a smaller or larger brush. As you can see here, I'm going over the form of the landscape, and what I'm trying to do is just pick up some of those interesting shadow areas and accentuate them. Just really help to sculpt three-dimensional form into our 2D photo. Just really helps to give the viewer a sense of that three-dimensional space. The version of dodge and burn that I'm doing here is pretty rough and ready compared to my usual standards. Now, how long you spend on your own dodge and burn is entirely up to you, but obviously the more time we can invest in getting this to look good, the better the end result is going to be. This is our opportunity to really put our artist's hat on and truly sculpt the image that we envisage in our mind. As I'm crafting the image like this, one of the things I'll ask myself is, what is the hero of this photo? What are the elements that I really want to draw attention to? And it's those elements that I'll really work hard to accentuate the contrast. So for example, the mountain in the background of this photo here, it was a little flat originally, and so I'm trying to help sculpt that 3D form, choosing a side I want to focus the light on, and consequently the shadows on the other side. The same is true for the road leading through the center of the frame. I want to darken down the ground around the road so that it gives it more pop. I want that road to stand out. So we burn down the edges, the grass there, and then I can come in with the dodge and burn tool in the lighten mode to bring the brightness level of that road up. As I open my new instance of dodge and burn tool and I switch to the lighten mode, you'll see as I make this stroke right here, this is far too heavy-handed. Having that strength set to even 50% is just way over the top. So bring that strength amount right down so that you can build this effect up with subsequent passes, subsequent clicks of the mouse, and just gently stroking that effect in. If you go too heavy-handed, it's just game over. So work your way around the image, keeping your eye on the areas where you think, you know what, this is a part that needs to be a little bit brighter. And as I said before, you do really need to look at this through the eyes of an artist. We're really kind of light painting at this point. So it's not just grabbing a slider and hoping that the tool takes care of it for us. this is our opportunity to really craft something special with our black and white. This is a throwback to the darkroom days, but being able to do the dodge and burn that they used to do there with a lot more finesse. And so what we're doing here is we're just looking for those little areas of light that exist in the scene already, and we're just pushing them a little further where we think they should be pushed further. It's also an opportunity for us to think, you know what, this area through the center of the frame here, through the middle of this valley, this is where I want my audience to look. And by lightening areas up and also adding more contrast, those are two techniques that we can use to really help guide the viewer's attention and say, this is important, look here. And so as we identify the heroes in our photo, so for me, the road, the mountainscape in the center of the frame, those are the areas that are prime for applying lightening techniques and also increased contrast. Okay, let's jump into the edit stack so that we can go back to the previous tool so we can see how before we added the dodge and burn tools, then we started to accentuate some of that light by darkening down some of those areas, and then we added some light in. So effectively what I'm doing is forcing in more three-dimensionality. So you can see on this hill in the background here, before the dodge and burn, we didn't have much sculpting going on. It looks very flat indeed. And so I chose a side I thought should be darker, the left-hand side, because there's more light in the cloud on the right-hand side. And then I brightened up the right-hand side. So we ended up with a more three-dimensional form like this. And it's that approach that we're literally taking throughout the photo, where we're looking for areas of light and shade, and we're just accentuating them. I feel like I may have darkened down this area a little bit too much, but no problem. We can come in, use the erase tool, and rather than get rid of the effect completely, we can just drop the strength down and then just paint away some of that darkening effect. Before and after, okay, that's a bit more subtle. I absolutely love this next tool. We find it in the creative section. It's the dramatic filter. If I put the amount up to 100, you can see what an extreme effect this has before and after. So we're going to need to finesse this look to get what we're after. If I push the local contrast all the way to 100, things get really gritty, high contrast in a localized way, and I don't like this overall look. However, if we take the local contrast in the opposite direction, we still get all of that lovely contrast added, but we've got it in a much more natural way. The most effective way to edit your images is to look at your photos not on a global scale overall. You want to look at individual sections of the photo and assess what certain adjustments are doing. So for example, in the land itself, I really like this adjustment. It's adding a nice bit of contrast in there. But in the sky, particularly through the area of most contrast, it's just brightening things up too much. So again, this is where we come in with our masking. I'm just going to grab a brush, make it nice and large, and with about a strength of about 50%, I'm just going to start to remove that from that very highlight part of the sky. Okay, so now we've got before and after. We've got the best of both worlds. We've got that lovely rich contrast through the landscape without it affecting our lovely long exposure sky. Because I want our viewers' attention to really hone into this central area of the photo where the road leads our eye in, I don't want the brightness level of the clouds to compete with the brightness through here. One of the simplest ways to deal with this in Luminar Neo would just be to use the brightness far slider and then just adjust the depth so that it's only impacting the sky. However, the slider's not really pushing that far enough back for us, so again, we could just use a basic brush just to paint this in very quickly over the sky like that, before and after, and we could go for another sweep if we want to just darken it down even more, before and after. And now you can see by darkening the sky down, that's really helped to guide our viewer's eye to this brighter part through the center of the frame, and I really like that. Another really simple tool for guiding our viewer's eye is just to add a vignette, a darkening down around the edge of the frame. That can really help to hold our viewer's eye in the most important part of the photo, before and after. However, I have an issue with using vignettes in this way. You can see how down here in the bottom left, we've pretty much lost all textural information in our photo, and that's not what I want to do. But if I start easing the amount back, I don't really get the full effect of that vignette. It's much more tame. So I prefer to tackle vignettes in a slightly different way. Instead, what I'm going to do is come into the Develop tool and jump into curves. If I grab this very top point here that represents our brightest pixels in the photo, and I actually bring those down, we're going to darken down the photo overall, but we're not pushing the blacks any deeper than they already are. And if we really want to protect the shadows, we can put a point on there and just lift that up ever so slightly. So now we've got before and after, an overall darkening of the photo without really taking those shadow pixels any deeper. Now what we can do is our own custom vignette. The easiest way to do that is with a radial gradient that we're going to bring out, and then we can reshape that. We can rotate it and then resize so that it fits nicely over our frame. Currently we've got the opposite of what we want, so we just need to click the invert, and now we can see where these red pixels are. That's where we're going to see the effect of what we just created. So here's our before and our after. We've now got our own custom vignette that's darkening down those edges just as we were after. However, if we look down here in these darker pixels in the bottom left, we still have all of that lovely textural information, the best of both worlds, before and after. In the background of the photo here, I feel like we've lost a little bit of local contrast. The areas that should be in shadow have now become a mid-grey. And so I want to see if I can bring a bit of drama back through this area here and just darken that down. A no editing video on black and white photography would be complete without a little bit of a look at luminosity masks. And so what I'm going to do is just set up an overall darkening through the whole photo. And now I'm going to try and apply that only into those shadows of the background of the hills here. So let's jump into masking, and this time luminosity masks. After Luminar's initial calculation, I'm just going to click into the photo on the pixels that I'd like to be affected by that tool. Now, if we jump out of the mask and look at the before and after, you can see that we have introduced a lot of contrast through this area, but we've also kind of destroyed the rest of the photo in the process. So all we need to do now is just erase that effect from the rest of the photo. So now we're left with that darkening effect that we created, but only in the specific area we wanted it. Now, before we get onto the finishing touches of a nice bit of color toning, I'd like to show you another method where we can increase the contrast in the photo whilst at the same time imbuing it with a really lovely subtle softness. I've got two methods for you, one that you can use if you don't have Luminar Neo, and then a much quicker approach if you do have Neo. So what you're going to do in any photo editor that supports layers, just duplicate this layer and then we're going to blur the layer. So in Neo, you do that with the creative section and the blur tool. And this time we're going to choose Gaussian blur. So if we get the amount and just start pushing that up, I don't know, somewhere around there looks about right. We close the tool and now we're going to come to the layer properties. And this is the same in Photoshop. If you come to the soft light option, hard light or overlay, you're going to increase the contrast. But now we have that nice softness from the blur we created. And of course, we don't have to be that heavy-handed. We can bring the opacity of that layer down and just introduce it to a point where we think it looks much nicer. And then if we hide the layer, we can see the before and then show the layer. That's our after. But in Luminar Neo, we have a tool that emulates that effect anyway. So I'm just going to remove that layer and show you how we can do it much quicker with my favorite tool that always gets a look in, and that is Mystical. So if I grab the amount slider of Mystical and I push that all the way to 100, looks pretty similar, right? Before and after, and that is because what's going on underneath the hood of this tool is basically doing what I showed you the manual way to do. But the great thing with the Mystical tool is we have more control. So if we don't want to darken down the shadows but actually lighten them, we can do that, or we can make them even darker. We can also play with the smoothness slider. So this would be the equivalent of how much blur you were applying to that secondary layer. And usually I like a slightly softer approach, and of course nowhere near as strong as we've got it at the moment. So this amount slider is akin to using the opacity slider with the other method. So here's our before and our after. The Mystical tool is really nice because we also have the ability to colorize our photo. So if we wanted to give it more of a sepia look or a sort of cyanotype look, we can do that with this tool and using that as our last adjustment. So here's our before and our after, but by doing it this way, we're introducing only one color tone. Let me show you how we can do it with two. And that is of course with the toning tool. And again, we have equivalents of this in other photo editing programs, but basically it allows us to color the highlights and color the shadows separately. And then we can finesse the look of those. Usually I like to add a little bit of blue into the shadows And for the highlights, I usually like to work with a warmer orange tone. And now I'll just bring the saturation down, and we can play with a balance slider so we can introduce more of the color into the highlights or more of the shadow color. Something like that looks good for this one. And now we can just reduce the amount. I think subtlety works best with a bit of color toning for black and whites, even something like that. Before and after, that's super subtle. Before and after. Yep, we'll go with that. All right, before we do my favorite bit, which is the before and after, if you don't have Luminar Neo yet and you like the look of it as a photo editing solution for you, I have a link in the description along with a discount code as well, currently on sale. So let's take a look at where we came from and where we got to. It's quite a dramatic transformation. Here is our original color, unprocessed raw photo, and here is our black and white transformation, the original, and now our crafted black and white. As you can see, using these techniques that I've shared with you in this video, we really can transform those black and white photos. You don't need to use this exact workflow and use every one of these techniques in each of your edits. Just pick and choose the techniques that you like the look of and created the results that you'd like to emulate in your own photography. Take these techniques and make them your own. Personally, I think this image would actually benefit from a different aspect ratio crop, and I'm thinking something like a square through this area here. We get rid of all of that redundant information on the left, not really doing too much for the photo, and it keeps it all centered around this much more interesting area through here. And now I've got the crop I like, I'm going to export a nice high quality JPEG version of that photo. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite or most useful tip was, and I will see you in another video. Why don't you check out that one that's appearing right there? YouTube thinks it might be a good fit for your viewing. So I'll see you in that video. Bye bye for now.